The CW superhero era was special. Whether I was 14 years old excited for a new season of Arrow, or 18 years old hoping not to be disappointed by The Flash, waiting every single week, whether it was a Monday, a Tuesday, or Wednesday night, for that brand new episode was always exciting. And of course, this was before the big streaming boom, before Stranger Things or anything like that. This was with DirecTV, with commercials. It was just normal. And if you missed the episode and you didn't TiVo it, you had to wait till it came back on TV, or you had to deal with the garbage CW website the next day. And as we have seen over the last 5 years, can you believe we're already 5 years into the 2020s? Streaming, of course, has taken over television. I'm not sharing some big secret, and we are witnessing shorter seasons with long production times and high budgets. And I really believe we're going to start getting nostalgic for this old format. Remember back in the day when you would be having seasons with like 23, 24 episodes per season? There are downsides to this, don't get me wrong, but at least we were guaranteed a new season every single year. Now we're just hoping for a new season every 2 years without some giant delay. I bring this up because I just wrapped up watching the final season of Superman and Lois. I'm just a little bit behind. It came out like 5-6 months ago, but after season 2, the show just kind of fell out of my rotation. I decided to pick it back up with Superman, of course, releasing this year, and finish it. And I came to two realizations while watching it. One, wow, it's crazy how good that show is and how well it ended, especially compared to pretty much all the other CW superhero shows, especially because it probably had one of the lower budgets of the superhero shows on CW, since they were basically just trying to wrap this whole world and era up. But speaking of era, my number 2 realization was, wow, we truly are at the end of an era. Although it did feel closer to what you would see today, with the final season only having 10 episodes, and a lot of tropes in other CW shows like toxic relationships and characters who have the emotional maturity of 12-year-olds were not present in this show, which is why it's one of the best on the CW. This is not a rise and fall video of the CW, because I think ultimately the fall of the Arrowverse was just a byproduct of its time. It had its generation, we lived through it, and eventually that peak was going to go down. But because I decided to watch Superman and Lois, I decided to go back and check out the original Arrowverse shows. The term Arrowverse got coined after Barry Allen was introduced in season 2 of Arrow, and he eventually would have his own show, and since Arrow was the origins of technically this universe, that's what the name became. However, Smallville came way before this and really was the true origins for DC television really making a name for itself. There were smaller shows on TV. There was a Wonder Woman show, there was a Flash 90s show, but Smallville in 2001 really kicked off this new era of superheroes on television. It released in 2001 on the WB network, yeah, not the CW. And this was where it lived from 2001 to 2006, but eventually it did merge with what would become the CW, where it stayed the rest of its time. What makes the rise of Smallville so interesting is the fact that it was not released on an ABC, NBC, or anything like that. It was released on this WB network, a network that not everybody had access to, and also the fact that it released in 2001, which is before Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, so it was before that true big superhero boom we would eventually see in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And without jumping in too much of a rabbit hole into Smallville, it went 10 years from 2001 to 2011. And what worked so well, although it had its shortcomings, and you can definitely feel not only the early 2000s CGI, you can also at times feel its small budget. The charming aspect of this show is not only what led it to have 10 years, but what also makes it remain one of the most popular superhero shows even today. It still has that nostalgic feel that will carry it for generations to come. I was trying to think. So, with the popularity of Smallville, the CW wanted to expand, and in fact, they tried. There were several attempts at creating Smallville spin offs even before Arrow. In 2006, Aquaman was a potential option, with Justin Hartley potentially playing the character. However, they already had a slight problem. Adam Richson's Aquaman was already introduced into Smallville, so they couldn't really figure out a way how to tie Justin Hartley's Aquaman into Smallville because they already had an Aquaman in Smallville. And remember, this was a time before they would just say he's from Earth 2 or Earth 5000 or wherever Earth they chose that day. They kind of set themselves in a corner and they couldn't find themselves out of it. But there were other attempts as well. The season 10 episode Booster, which introduced the character Blue Beetle, was seen as a potential backdoor pilot for a show with that character. I think in the case of a Blue Beetle spinoff, I think it was just at the wrong time. Remember, this was before the MCU would popularize introducing small superheroes people really didn't know unless you were a hardcore comic reader. And of course, this is before the Blue Beetle movie. So just in the wrong place and wrong time for that. However, the Flash is a known superhero and a very popular superhero at that. And of course, Smallville had their own Flash in it, being Bart Allen, and that was a potential spinoff as well, with Kyle Gallner coming back to play that character. However, this was just a rumor by an executive, and that quickly changed after the failed Aquaman spinoff. Laura Vandervoort, who played Supergirl, was apparently told that there was a potential spinoff with her character as well. Pretty much all the other superheroes introduced in Smallville had a potential for a spinoff at some point. However, none more famous than Justin Hartley's Green Arrow, which he originally was pitched the idea of him in 2006, and then was even talked about being brought back in 2012 when Arrow was first in production after Smallville wrapped. However, the team decided they just wanted to do something completely different, not tied to Smallville, and I think they also wanted to look at a more realistic look at Oliver Queen, which would explain the dark, edgy feel we get in Season 1. Also at the time, this was when Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy had finished up, so dark, edgy superheroes were the wave, and of course the CW had to cash in at it. And that is where we pick up with the beginning of Arrow and the start of the Arrowverse. Of course, if Smallville was the prequel, Arrow was the true beginning. A show that would lead to a world that would last a decade. And these new shows, man, they have such high quality, high production, high budgets. It's really interesting to then go back and watch season 1 of Arrow after just consuming streaming content for the last 5 years. And you can just feel the nostalgia. First of all, 24 episode long plot lines, which means there was going to be some filler in there. Of course, the classic, well, not in this case, but Freak of the Week, which Smallville got known for early on, having different bad guys Oliver had to face. And you can feel the smaller budget at time, and really, most importantly, the jokes that in 2012 really landed, but today definitely don't hit as hard.
I highly recommend Carmen Golden.
Which one is she?
The one who looks like the chick from Twilight.
What's Twilight?
You're so better off not knowing.
And let's not forget about the melodrama, the relationships, that since there were so many episodes, had time to develop. Oh, the toxicity of these characters as well. Everybody couldn't be trusted. Everybody was a snake. It was like a reality show set in a superhero universe. But season 1 of Arrow was special. Yeah, it's funny to go back and look, and there's some things you can make fun of the same way you can make fun of early 2000s Smallville. But that dark, edgy vibe, kind of going for the Batman way, was really a good idea. And the decision to make Oliver essentially Bruce Wayne, he even kind of made a slight reference to that in the season, was really a smart decision. It really grounded the character. And although we got later over the top storylines and plot lines, what made season one so special was it somewhat felt realistic. And this isn't just me saying this. Arrow was really popular. I mean, season 1 ratings averaged about 3.68 million viewers per week, which is by far the highest on the network. And that is why it made sense that a spin-off was coming. And of course, with the MCU already existing, there was a blueprint to make a joined universe. So in season 2, episode 8, titled The Scientist.
Great. Who the hell are you?
And do your parents know that you're here? I'm Barry Allen. I'm from the Central City Police Department. I'm with the Crime Scene Investigation Unit. We're working on a case with some similar unexplained elements in Central City. So when the report of your robbery came over the wire, my captain sent me up here.
We got introduced to Grant Gustin's Barry Allen. And at the end of the next episode, we would see the scene where Barry would get struck by lightning, eventually becoming the Flash, when they would replay that scene and then obviously expand on it in the pilot of The Flash later on. The Flash actually wouldn't air for almost a year later, which I completely forgot about, airing in October of 2014, and we officially had the start of the Arrowverse. And it's tough to say which show was more popular at the time. Flash season 1 came in when Arrow was about to see its initial decline in season 3, and of course the real decline in season 4 until the bounce back in season 5. So without going into the numbers, I'll just say it from my perspective. Now, this is one person's perspective who grew up in a normal suburban town in high school. What I saw was the Flash being more popular among my friends, girls and guys. The Flash just seemed to be more popular, except for like my really superhero nerd friends who of course preferred Arrow, which definitely makes sense. Arrow was more of a dude show, kind of like Jack Reacher is today. The Flash probably had more of an appealing vibe to everybody. It was a lot lighter of a tone, a lot more jokes. The villains were way lighter as well.
Barry, you live in Central City, where it's sunny all the time, and your enemies get cute nicknames.
And that clip, although directed at just Barry, remained true. The Flash had bad guys with nicknames, and Arrow didn't. And Arrow had Oliver killing people, and of course Barry was not doing that. And the side characters in The Flash at the time were seen as way more quirky and less serious. Of course, Arrow would introduce quirky and less serious side characters later, but this is why I always found myself watching Arrow. Maybe it was because I was a 15-year-old and I was edgy at the time, but I always just preferred the dark, gritty tone of Arrow, and I stuck through it all 8 seasons, through the ups and downs of all of it. But either way, both shows were extremely popular as the last generation before streaming. Eventually, with the success these shows brought more shows in, with Supergirl coming out a little over a year later. And it actually originally aired on CBS, which owns CW. I think the network thought that since Supergirl is a more known character, it would just do numbers justifying it to be on a bigger network. However, that quickly changed, and by season 2, it got moved straight to the CW, which is honestly where it fit. And the biggest difference with Supergirl compared to Arrow and Flash, I would say, is the immediate success we saw with Flash and Arrow, especially just popularity-wise and ratings-wise. And Supergirl did not. It was not super popular right off the bat. Season 1 wasn't loved by everybody the way those other 2 shows were. And this is where we kind of saw the downfall of the CW begin. It's not that Supergirl brought the downfall and it's all that show's fault. I think it was more of a mindset of the CW just started introducing characters and characters and characters, and unfortunately, I think they just bit off more than they can chew. I think what the CW did was special, creating a superhero world on television with small budgets. However, they tried to introduce too many characters too quickly, and that is when we saw those budgets, those small budgets, really come into effect. I mean, if you look at late season Flash or just any moment in Supergirl, you can really feel those small budgets. And at times, the CGI just looks really amateur and just really poor production. Even though Supergirl didn't see immediate success, the CW still introduced more shows, which is why in 2016 we got DC Legends of Tomorrow. This show would be a hodgepodge of side characters from other shows, including Sarah Lance, Adam, Heatwave. We would see Captain Cold, just a whole bunch of characters that were introduced in The Flash and Arrow among them and brought in together, and again was going for more of that light-hearted storytelling, not really focused so much on the dark grittiness that made Arrow so popular. What I believe defined CW superhero shows is that they were trying to keep up with whatever was popular at the time. Arrow, when introduced in 2012, was when superhero movies and shows were going for more of that dark, gritty, realistic look, right? Man of Steel came out. The Amazing Spider-Man came out. We were coming off the Dark Knight trilogy. Then the MCU came in and made superhero movies back to more of that lighthearted, joking, less serious, and that's eventually what the CW would become. And I'm not going to sit here and say I'm an expert of DC Legends of Tomorrow, Black Lightning, or Stargirl, because frankly, I didn't watch those shows through and through, but they did try to go for more of that lightheartedness we would later see in future MCU movies. And when you look at the dates of when these shows were all on television, it would make sense when you look at what was popular in the superhero genre at the time. When Arrow ended, it really felt like it was the end of an era. That was when I stopped watching the CW superhero shows altogether. I was over The Flash at that point. It had been bad for a few seasons, and this was right before we got Superman and Lois. Wait, I guess let me backtrack for a second before I talk about Superman and Lois and why it really was a great ending to the CW Arrowverse. So Tyler Hoechlin's Superman was first introduced in season 2 of Supergirl. It was supposed to be a one-off thing. Tyler Hoechlin said this in a podcast with Michael Rosenbaum. He was like, cool, checked off the superhero thing, get to tell my kids I played Superman for an episode, all good. Well, he was popular. He got brought back in later episodes. He also got brought back in spin-offs. And then, eventually, he got told that there was a potential for him to get his own show. It was just unfortunate timing for this show to come out when it did. First of all, it came out a few months after Arrow had aired its final episode on January 28th, 2020, after running 8 seasons, and this actually last season only had 10 episodes, but after running 8 seasons, Arrow finally hit its end, and everyone was kind of done with the CW superhero verse. However, the CW verse wasn't done quite just yet. Although we were eventually going to quickly see the end of not only Arrow, but The Flash was ending, Black Lightning, DC Legends of Tomorrow, they were all getting canceled basically at the same time. Superman and Lois was just about to air, and on February 23rd, 2021, the first season of Superman and Lois aired. However, there was one thing that made this show different than all of the other Arrowverse shows. Maybe it was because it was Superman and DC was like, nah, we got to put more budget into this. It actually got an HBO Max budget, which you can clearly see in the first season of the show. The lighting, the cinematography, the effects, they look like what you would be accustomed to seeing on all of the networks you see today, on HBO Max, on Disney Plus, on Hulu. We really got a high budget Superman television show. But because of the Arrowverse just being burnt out by everybody, the show did not see immediate success. Seeing only 1.7 million total viewers in its first episode, which is about half of what Arrow got in 2012 for Superman. That was just the CW. Fortunately, this show aired on HBO Max, which really gave it footing to not only have a first season, but get 4 seasons total. And this is where an opinion comes in. You might not like Superman and Lois as much as you might like Arrow or The Flash, but it's safe to say that universally, Superman and Lois is seen to be the most consistent show of the Arrowverse. And what I think is interesting, looking at the fact that universally this show is seen as the most consistent across all 4 seasons, only really seeing a drop-off maybe in season 2, is that once the CW only had one superhero show to focus on, it got right back to where we saw in Arrow season 1. I think, like I said earlier, the Arrowverse CW got stretched too thin. They were trying to do too much with a budget that just didn't support it. And Superman and Lois was a great way to cap off the CW Arrowverse. And although season 4 had significant budget cuts, and you can definitely feel it at times with characters just being straight up cut from the show basically, other than guest appearances, and plot lines being rushed through that normally they would have gone to address in full season long storylines, what made season 4 so special is because of that, the writing team got to focus on what the show initially was about, which was family. And we saw them just focus on the end of Clark Kent and the death of Superman, the official death of Superman as he got older, and focus on the rise of the 2 sons, and leading to, in my opinion, the best finale of the CW superhero shows we have ever seen. It might have not been the most glamorous, it might have not hit the peak of what Smallville was, but just a one that could put a smile on your face as we say goodbye to a bygone era of superhero shows releasing weekly on a network that normally doesn't have high budgets, but yet we go back to watch these shows now with a ton of nostalgia, a ton of love for an era that we probably will never see again. And by the way, I say all this because I was having nostalgia for the CW. What HBO Max does, what Disney Plus does, what any of these new streaming services produce is way better than what we got in 2012. And although it is great to go back and look at what Arrow did and what Arrow was, and really just what that Arrowverse was and how much of a feat it was for such a small budgeted team, what we get now on HBO Max and, like I said, Disney Plus is way better. The quality's way better. We may not get the highest of highs like we might have gotten, but the lows are way less low on these streaming services than what we would ever have seen on the CW. But let me know, what is your favorite CW superhero show of all time? For me, I gotta go Arrow. Even though I think Superman and Lois is probably better, Arrow is by far my favorite. That show impacted me all throughout my high school years, so I have a ton of nostalgia for it, so I'm gonna pick Arrow. But let me know what yours is in the comment section below. I appreciate y'all watching today. Hit the subscribe button for more content coming in the future. Hit the like button so it hits the algorithm. And I still have some old videos up, so if you want to see some old content from me, videos I recorded when I was in high school, I think I made a video about Disney, content like that coming in the future. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys next time. Peace out, guys.